And thank you all for coming. Welcome our guests. This is the monthly CARFAC meeting. And the first item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes, which I emailed to you, and Bill emailed as well. Are there any corrections to the minutes? No? Okay. Well, then the minutes stand as written and reviewed. Thank you. All right, our next item on the agenda is the 2017 project review. And it occurs to me that for the sake of our visitors and the public at large, would like to make the distinction that CARFAC has really two sets of responsibilities. One set is standing, and that each year we're supposed to carry out these responsibilities at the behest of the commissioners. And then each year, depending on what their needs are, they ask us to take on special projects. So the standing commitments of CARFAC are to meet with the township auditors annually before and at the conclusion of each audit, to review the quarterly financial statements, which is what we're going to do this evening, the year-end statements, with many detailed items within that. Review the progress of audit recommendations by the township, or to the township, and any other projects or tasks as assigned to it by the Township Board of Commissioners. And this year, we have certain requests from the Board of Commissioners, and we've grouped them into categories of planning and budgeting, audit, and operations. So I'll just briefly highlight these for you. In terms of planning and budgeting, we've been asked to continue our analysis of the township's funding of its capital plan and long-term liabilities to include how Radnor compares to other municipalities to help the board determine appropriate funding and the most suitable rate of return for use in calculating the municipality's minimum obligation, or MMO. And we will continue to update, refine, and design additional uses for the 5-year planning model that we generated years ago. With respect to payments in lieu of taxes, or pilot, research what has been done by other governments, what is possible, and how the board might meet with more success in negotiating with local nonprofits, and also to determine the cost of serving nonprofits in Radnor. Also, to develop a comprehensive set of financial metrics to assist the commissioners in their management of the township finances. And finally, within this category, conclude our investigation of the benefits and costs of striving to improve the township's credit rating with Moody's from AA1 currently to AAA, provided that the board approves the payment of additional money for certain research, which it has just recently done. So that project will move ahead. In the area of audit, which is really our most senior commitment to the board, this being the Citizens Audit Review and Financial Advisory Committee, we have several items here. The first is to oversee the audit plan and process, interact with the public accounting firm staff, to continue to work with township staff and auditors to identify and address material weaknesses and significant deficiencies revealed in the audit process. Meet with the board to present our findings, identify and report on key performance indicators. Obtain the board's approval and acceptance of the audit. And finally, continue to work with township staff to improve financial controls and processes. In the area of operations, there's only 2 items now. The first is to continue to monitor and guide the implementation of the new administrative software solution for the township, which has got an 18-month implementation cycle. And secondly, to review the township's financial statements and unfunded liabilities quarterly, track the key performance indicators, and report to the board annually or as needed. So that's our basic work plan for this year. Now we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is project updates. And the first one here is capital and long-term liability. So, Jerry?
Okay, thanks, Mark. So we had a subcommittee meeting 2 weeks ago. So the group that's on this includes myself, includes Leo, includes Mary, and includes yourself, Mark. So that's the four of us on that group. So in terms of the two parts, in terms of the capital, what we did at our first meeting or our first two meetings, we actually scoped out the work we want to do for the year in more detail, as well as laying out the timing of what we need to do and how it dovetails in with the township's ongoing budgeting process and as they start to look for the budget for 2018. So on the capital, the big thing there, picking up from the work we did last year, the big thing will be how will the 2018 and forward capital be funded. So I'm looking at some different options for doing that. So as a prerequisite, one of the things we need to wait for is to have Township Administration work with the Board of Commissioners to go through the whole capital plan again, the whole 5-year capital plan. So we understand that that's going to be scheduled in the next few months. There will likely be a special Board of Commissioners meeting to do that. So once the items in the capital plan are laid out, then we can pick it up from there, look at some of the two big areas which we helped define last year, the pay-as-you-use and the pay-as-you-go aspect of it. The pay-as-you-go part is, pretty much funded by general revenues for that year. That's something that's been in place for a couple of years now, which was always the goal. It got there sooner than anticipated when we first looked at this several years ago. So the open question is funding the pay-as-you-use type of things. So we'll take a look at that, come up with some thoughts on different ways to fund it and some pros and cons for the Board of Commissioners to consider. And in terms of the timing of presenting that, we're shooting to do that towards the either the very end of the summer or the very beginning of the fall, sort of before the budget process starts to take place, and that'll be one of the things we'll look at with the 5-year plan, and that'll be one of the key inputs going into the budget process. So that would be the appropriate timing for us to provide that. In terms of long-term liabilities, the big thing here is the pensions, and as I think everyone on CARFAC knows, but everyone else may not know, so part of the process is dictated by the state is that there's every 2 years, all the townships, including Radnor, need to do a actuarial valuation of their pension funds. So in that 2-year cycle that's coming up now, it'll take place this year based on what the financials of the pension plans were on January 1st of 2017. They'll do the actuarial evaluation, and that'll impact then the budget either as soon as 2018 or potentially into 2019. So the big things to look at there are any changes in assumptions about rate of return, any potential options to supplement the funding with some additional infusions of assets into those funds as was done in the past. And those are some of the things we'll be taking a look at. So as everyone on CARFAC knows, this is a continuation of a project we did last year. One of the things, so we'll certainly update the information we did last year, but the other thing we've been asked to take a look at more specifically is how does Radnor compare with some of our peer townships, some of the townships adjacent to us, as well as townships around the state, townships that maybe are similar to Radnor, and how do we compare so we can give that information to the Board of Commissioners so they can pick a level of funding that they think is appropriate for Radnor, but have that comparative information. So that's a little bit of a new dimension to what we did before. And we're targeting that report to come out before the summer, either shooting for, I think, a June timeframe for coming with that information, so it's timely as then the Board of Commissioners needs to make decisions how to set the rate of return into the actuarial valuation coming up. So that's the report on our subcommittee.
One, if I could, real quick, one thing to add with regard to the timing is I talked with our representative at Mockenhop, and they, in terms of when they would need to know assumption changes and any kind of funding changes that the township plans on incorporating with the next actuarial update. She said that in order to have them in time to include with our first draft of the MMO, which is required by the state to be before September 30th of every year. So for the 2018 MMO, we'd have to have that in front of the Board of Commissioners, most likely at their second meeting in September. She said she would need to know that several weeks in advance. Most of the work she said that she's going to do for the actuarial update, they have the information on. It's mostly demographic type information. But any kind of assumption changes, she said they just need a matter of weeks. So a June target date to have whatever Carfax report's going to end up being to the commissioners seems like a good idea. That gives the commissioners then the summer to decide before any kind of action needs to make it to Mockenhop.
I'm sorry. Thank you again, Jerry and Bill. First time doing it with the microphone stuff here. But our next item on the agenda is the pilot review, the payments in lieu of taxes, and that's Mike Antonopoulos.
We had a subcommittee meeting in February, and people on the committee is myself, Mark, and Helen. Just to put things in perspective, a pilot in lieu of taxes that we're reviewing, it relates to nonprofit organizations doing something in lieu of paying taxes. There's another way that pilots come into play, and that's when townships, in order to encourage development, will relieve the burden of the full taxes and work out an alternative tax initiative that is lower than what ordinarily would be done. That's not the case here. So, on the pilot when dealing with nonprofits, it's a unilateral decision. The township has no authority to force a nonprofit, and let's use Villanova, not to pick on Villanova, but let's use them as an example, to force them to pay something in lieu of taxes. It's voluntary. For all intent and purposes, it's out of the goodness of their heart that they want to do something, unless the township wants to use pressure, either as other townships have. I have a meeting set up with Lower Marion, and I'm waiting for calls with True Different and Upper Marion, and I know all those townships use leverage with development. So if you have development being done by a nonprofit organization, you can say to them, you're going to have to take a percentage of your development and is a payment in lieu of taxes, and apply that to infrastructure, whatever. The township historically has not chosen to take that as a method of operation. We, in speaking with Bill White, we learned that as it relates to Villanova, there's and Mark, correct me, but the township can review the codes with respect to their dormitories, which we don't do. We rely on them to give us their own review. That is one way that we could force upon them to, we're going to go there and review their codes for their dormitories, and they have to pay us a certain stipend for that. But anything that and we've talked about different things, and please, Mark and Helen, chime in. We've talked about a number of different things, you know, the trails going up to the Villanova and the various Cabrini and Easter, and saying, look, we have these trails that are coming in, they're going to benefit everything, they're going to benefit your students, why don't you contribute? What we've heard in the past is every time some overture has been made to any of the nonprofits, they opine that they've already contributing by virtue of their students. Their students spent a lot of money, and therefore they made their contribution. We're going to discuss this further, and we will. I will talk to the other townships to see if there's something there. But by and large, I'm not so sure what can be done unless the township wants to take a more proactive approach to maybe strong arming, but maybe that's not, but getting the various nonprofit institutions to recognize the value and the services that are provided, and pay something in lieu of the fact that they're not paying any taxes. Whether that happens or not, who knows? But again, I want to stress, it's purely unilateral and voluntary with the nonprofit. End of tune. So we'll review it further and see if there's any, and of course we'll have further discussions amongst ourselves. Everyone got the email. There was 2 emails. I sent an email out, then Mark responded. So in its aggregate, that was I should have sent it out in a more complete fashion. Helen agreed with what the aggregate was. But we should be able to, hopefully we can think of something else. I'm not optimistic because it is purely voluntary, so you have to appeal to their esprit de corps and their emotion to the township. But as I said when we had our meeting, if I were in their shoes, I wouldn't do anything because I don't have to.
Just a thought. I mean, I'm not trying to squeeze money out of nonprofits. They have a tough enough time as it is. But, so for instance, if we just happen to have a very mild winter this year, but I mean, is there a way to talk to them and say, look, you know, in a period of time, because what we're really worried about is the infrastructure, the roads, the repair of the roads, for everyone's safety, making sure that we have enough money, not only for the main roads, but for also the side roads, which from time to time the side roads aren't getting the same attention that the main roads are. So is there some way to sort of come up with something that would say, gee, you know, in a winter where we have, you know, extremely cold weather and many storms, and as a result we, you know, tap out our budget or exceed our budget, you know, would you mind pitching in and helping us to some degree to help mitigate the stress on the township? So it's not just, we're not just blanketly asking them, we're asking them when there's a need and, you know, a demonstrated need. And maybe they would be a little bit more amenable because we're treating them with some diligence to squeeze out a little bit of funds to help, because it's helping the community. It's not just, you know, filling over. It's not just us. I mean, it's really helping the community. And we're all part of the same community. We're all part of that brotherhood.
Yes.
Anyway, that was just a suggestion.
Well, we discussed that. And Bill, where were some of the, we discussed the fact that the use of services and how they could contribute. And the only one that we thought that might be able to be carved out would be the fire company, since that's a non-township payment.
Right. Yeah, what I was referring to was a program that was discussed publicly back in 2012. I might not have the exact year correct there, but that's the ballpark, 11 or 12. We called it a I forget the exact title, but it was a voluntary contribution for services type of program, where we reached out to the three large universities and college and universities in town, and we had identified, we had stipulated that any payment made would go directly towards offsetting the cost of fire, EMS, police, and public works, to your point, Michael, because those are the three areas where those universities use the publicly funded services, or at least at the time. Now, Villanova has since hired its own internal police department, which is, I don't have any statistics or data that tells us exactly how much that has relieved our police department, if at all. But that might be one area where it's not a big a factor today as it was back in 2011 or 12. But to Mary's point, part of the reason why we identified Public Works is the road impact for snow removal, pothole repairs, those types of things. And then the EMS is the other one. While that's not something that the township manages itself, the township is the primary funding source for the volunteer fire companies and EMS services that provide service to all three of the universities and the whole township for that matter. So those would be the three areas. At least those are the three we identified back in 2000 with the last program in 11 or 12, and why.
Just to dovetail, the one thing that we discussed and we can discuss as a group is rather than getting the nonprofits to offer payment out of the goodness of their heart, the other way is, as I alluded to or mentioned, is to tie permitting, to the extent that it's legal, permitting, any kind of other approvals tied to development, to a payment of some sort to the township for infrastructure. I was involved with a project with Prudential and Freedom Business Center, which was where American Baptist Church is, and that was back in 85, 86, maybe 87, I can't remember. But North Gulf Road, Prudential back then had to give $2 million to Upper Marion Township just for the right to build we did 2 buildings. That was $2 million back then to widen the road, put a stoplight right there at the intersection. So this is not new for any township. It shouldn't be new to this township. It may be new to have the resolve to do that, but unless you have a very good basis to cajole somebody to do something out of the goodness of their heart, then you have to pick an alternative, which is what I just said, or just resign yourself to the fact that a payment in lieu of taxes is just not something to pursue, and put it aside and focus on something else.
Thank you, Mike. I have just a couple questions and comments on that. First, I'd like to acknowledge, as a financial advisor, economist type, I can appreciate the economic and other benefits of having anchors, economic anchors in our communities, the universities in particular, because they don't move away and they bring a constant flow of consumers in. And I don't know all the background there, but just from the report that we got, that we had approached them about the inordinate costs of policing their university. Later, they created their own police department. So I must imagine that that had a beneficial effect in relieving some of our efforts over there, because they have their own patrolmen or patrol police on patrol over there. So that sounds to me like a responsiveness. I have a question for you, Bill, in that, and I know this is more of Bob's domain, Bob Tate's, but in terms of the business privilege tax and so forth, do the canvassing efforts that are undertaken on behalf of the township to identify businesses that wittingly or unwittingly are not paying taxes due extend to the profit-making aspects of some of the universities and other nonprofits? In other words, there's certain aspects of what they do which don't fit into the tax exempt category. And I just wonder if we've conducted an updated search for identifying those in the case that they hadn't just said, you know, we're doing this and we should start paying taxes.
Yeah, so I'll start by reminding everyone that I can't get into specifics. The Taxpayer Bill of Rights prevents us from discussing any single entity's business privilege or mercantile returns or situations. But globally speaking, our efforts to enforce the laws is comprehensive. So it reaches not just the for-profit, but also the non-for-profit entities within the township. And if there were any reviews done on those where determinations were made as to whether something was taxable or non-taxable, those reviews are updated periodically, depending on, you know, major changes that might exist within, you know, if a for-profit business adds a new product and there's a sharp increase in gross receipts, that might cause us to call them up and ask some questions. So the same would exist with any of the entities, including the colleges and those things. So that's a long way of saying yes, they are included in our reviews.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Anything else on the pilot conversation? Okay, well, next we have stakeholders report and financial metric development, and Mary?
Sure.
that's
So
you.
with respect to the stakeholders report, I haven't undertaken that project just yet, so it's on my agenda for the upcoming month. But I have done quite a bit of work on CARFAC metrics proposed with Bill. And basically, you know, as you said, the concept of coming up with these financial metrics was increased transparency, a way for the commissioners to have an appreciation for how well we're performing relative to the operating plan, and then I think also a basis for us to do comparison benchmarking with the other towns, you know, Upper Marion, Lower Marion, TE, et cetera. So what I've done is I've put together a list of metrics. I sort of broke them out into different categories. Cash flow, a set of metrics around cash flow, some metrics I'll call liquidity metrics, which really you know, talk about the township's debt and their ability to cover their interest and their short-term debt payments. I also have some metrics, I'll call them efficiency metrics, where we talk about accounts receivable turnover, you know, which would be, you know, revenues billed to date and how successful we are in collecting them, the aging of those. Fixed asset turnover, we'd have to exclude certain fixed assets, but there are some assets that are clearly used for the purpose of the township, and whether or not, how quickly they're turning over, whether or not we're realizing the benefit of those assets, a metric like that would be helpful. And even total asset turnover, which really is just a metric looking at total revenues and seeing how they are relative to the total assets that the township has under their purview. The other category, we have leverage metrics. You know, certainly the township's got, you know, I don't know if it's a substantial amount of long-term debt, but we certainly have, it's more long-term debt than I have to pay. So it's a fairly sizable number. So some metrics around debt, you know, debt to fund balance. There isn't a concept of equity in this because it's a township, so I have about 3 or 4 of those. And then some profitability ratios, which also we have. And then we also have some other ratios around change in net assets, operating resilience, and we'll call it operating reserve. So I went over these metrics with Bill. And this is government accounting. This is not corporate accounting. So, you know, basically the financial statements that the township puts together on a quarterly basis are not on an accrual basis. They're on a cash basis. So most of these metrics would be annual metrics. So when we get the annual audited financial statements, we'd have a comparable balance sheet, and we'd have, you know, a fund statement, and we'd be able to put these metrics together. So what I've committed to do is to clean up this document, There's some metrics that I have in here that, we don't think are really appropriate. Put them together. We're also going to look at the reports from the various townships and see if we can gather comparable metrics from their reports over the last 3 years. So this way I'll give you a benchmark comparison. So at the next meeting, I think it'll be, sort of ready for prime time in terms of here's a proposal on the metrics that we think might be useful. Here's the benchmarking against the other townships. And then I think we could have a fairly rich dialogue. So sort of really, I think we've made quite a bit of progress on this as well. And then with respect to the stakeholders report, I just have to schedule a meeting with Jerry to have him take me through what the process is. It's the first time I'm doing it. And that's where I stand.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments for Mary? Okay. Next on the agenda, the credit rating project. And Carl, that would be you.
Great, thank you. So this project is really a continuation of a project which started during our last year, and we've actually made a lot of progress very recently in the last 2 to 3 days. So the goal of the project is to look at the benefit to the township and potential costs if we were to step forward our credit rating up to the highest possible credit rating by Moody's. So we are 1 step below the highest right now. So there's really 3 prongs we're looking at. Is 1, what is the financial cost of moving to that position, and then what would be the financial benefit to us from a lending side of being in that position, coupled with any potential future cost if we were ever to fall back, meaning is falling back from the top notch down 1 put us in a worse position than where we are even currently. To accomplish this, what we want to do is we want to take a very deep dive into how Moody's views townships and rates them. So we know that there are known quantitative metrics, known qualitative metrics, and some soft-sided metrics of what they look into. We also want to take some time to look at the steps that would be needed if we wanted to move forward versus active things that we could do versus passive elements of just the passage of time. A lot of these metrics are 3, 5, and 10-year rolling numbers. So as better financial years have come to the township, are these going to naturally occur, or are there things that we have to be very direct in doing to change how we're positioned by Moody's? Our hope is also to take a look at what it would mean for an employment standpoint, a township resident standpoint, and is that something that our townspeople that are living here care about very much? Is there more than just a financial side? Is there a soft-sided benefit of this? To do this, we are looking to engage PFM, who is a specialist in this area, to assist us in doing the review and provide us some analytics. And as of yesterday, the township has entered into an agreement that's been signed. We have a signed letter of intent, and we're going to be moving forward. And the hope is that they will come back to us with a detailed report by May, which we can turn around and give back to the commissioners as what our thoughts are if this is something we want to continue pushing forward with.
Or what other townships around here have the top rating?
So the most best known township, right now, Radnor Township is rated by 1 agency. That's, according to PFM, the most common. It costs money to be rated by each agency. So for a strong municipality, 1 agency would be the straightest way to be rated. Lower Merion Township is rated AAA by 2 agencies, and one of the longest running townships to ever have done that, which they take as a very big point of pride. I believe Upper Merion is due to the strong income base of the mall and other development in that area. And I believe also Two Different Easton is as well.
Is there any opportunity to pit Moody's against S&P and kind of do almost a rating shop, since we only need 1 anyway?
PFM is going to look at that and see if that's a benefit. Their view was what they're looking at is all very, very similar. We have some very, very strong points, Villanova University being one of them. The hospital systems that we have in our area and near our area are all very strong. They obviously are going to give us a more formal view in their written comments, but really the passage of time of a few difficult years of the township falling off is probably going to be our strongest element to move forward. And their view is, you've been with Moody's for a while, there's really no reason to go out, and you would rarely ever go out and ask to be rated unless you were going to be doing a debt issuance. So the real thought is start to do some things now in advance of the next time we would naturally be looking for a debt issuance, and then at that time, try to determine who we want to get rated by.
And we've discussed, in the past, because this is not a new issue, that it may be difficult to get on, economics notwithstanding, but once you have the rating, it's difficult to lose it. Is that an accurate statement? All things being equal?
I don't know the answer to that. That's something we
Bill,
can
do you know
certainly
the
ask.
answer
I'm
to
not
that? Because we've
sure of
discussed that.
Yeah, well, in my discussions with PFM, the slope to obtain AAA is a lot more gradual than the slope to lose it. So I think the answer to your question is that the downgrade could be easier to achieve than the upgrade.
It's opposite what I thought it was in our discussions.
Yeah, I mean, in our discussions over the years on this, the AAA rating is something that that from Moody's perspective, they take very seriously. So they want to be very sure of creditworthiness before they give that rating. So that's why it's harder to achieve. And then, you know, as we'll learn when we get the information from PFM and go through the methodology, there's a whole plethora of both controllable and non-controllable factors that could cause that to go the other way on us. So, and then as Carl mentioned, understanding what the risks then are associated with going the other way.
I think the only other point I'd like to make is, you know, there's been some talk by others saying, well, how could this really matter? Rates are so low from a debt cost to the township borrowing. And I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that that's a current element. As rates are starting to spread, obviously the Fed, you know, made a move today, but as rates start to spread, you're going to start to see a wider gap there. So I think we need to plan for where we're going to be 5, 10, 15 years down the road, not for where rates are and the compression of rates today.
Any other questions or comments on that topic? Okay. Well, as it happens, the next item is the audit. Ed Kane is unable to join us this evening, but Carl, you're in that work group. Would you be able to brief us on that?
Sure.
Thank you.
We had a conference call with Bob Tate and 3 representatives from our auditing firm, ZA. So we had the managing partner on the engagement, the senior as well as the staff person. They 2 were here in the office. The partner was in transit, myself and Ed Kane, and they have started field work. We have gone over the calendar. They think this will be their 2nd year doing the audit, so they're expecting field work and moving through just knowing who to ask for information, how our systems operated, to things to be even smoother this year. Although, you know, I do want to say things were very smooth last year. There was no issue, but they're hoping for an even easier period going through. And we are certainly on track to get all the approvals and the CAFR to CARFAC and then to the board in fine time. So they are here, they're doing field work, they have a schedule set out, things are moving forward well.
As I recall, there was one item that was noted by the accountants, the auditors last year. Is that the item that's being addressed by the information system that's being put in?
The new information system is going to address a series of internal controls and items that have been known for some time. So they're certainly going to be spending more time looking at the implementation of that plan and what it's going to be able to accomplish. Now remember, this is an audit of the prior fiscal year. The new IT system is being implemented over in 18 months. So it probably more would be a commentary item of where we're moving than how it's been affected. One of the other big elements are that we are continuing to discuss how governmental changes in how liabilities are reported is something we're going to look at. So we're going to continue to want to see our statements under current regulatory guidelines as well as where we know they are going, and make sure that we are being as open in disclosure as possible to show how things will look under new laws that are coming down the pike in the next 36 to 48 months.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments?
Do you mind if I just add to that real quick? Yeah, the one item that was reported on, and it's a recurring item for the past several years, deals with how the township is accounting for our capital assets right now, being that it's off system on a spreadsheet. So that is that was part of one of that was one of the go, no-go decision makers when we were determining which software company to go with. So that's absolutely part of our ERP. Some of the other areas that Carl mentioned a moment ago are new reporting requirements that GASB is handing down with regard to some of our long-term liabilities and how they're reported. I just, because there's a larger audience, I just want to make it clear that what the auditors reported on was the capital assets. The GASB items are new, and there's certainly something that with Carfax assistance are things that the township will report on and comply with, as we've done with the other GASB pronouncements that they put out usually every year or so.
Thank you, Bill. All right, we're getting close to the end here. Software implementation. This is the software system we were just referring to. That would be Jerry.
Okay, so this subcommittee is myself and Mary and Mark, and this has been going on for some time now. We've had this subcommittee helped in assessing the needs as well as assisting the township in the selection process of a financial system, some decisions about how to deploy it, whether it be done housed in-house or cloud-based, and the township is now well in the throes of the implementation. So one of the key things coming up is the first go live of the first set of modules for the core financials, and that'll take place July 1st. I attended one of the sessions that the township had for one of the training sessions and observed that. We also had a steering committee meeting, which is the group of 3 of us, along with Bill, that we had 2 weeks ago. Sort of reviewed where things were at. Sounds like everything's everything's in good shape. Certainly a big undertaking. It's certainly taking up a huge amount of time of the finance department as well as others of the township staff, but everything seems to be on track. So one of the other key things is there's a go live planning session next week that the township has with the software vendor. So that'll be a key milestone to have that discussion, make sure everything's in place. But otherwise, it's full steam ahead for the July 1st implementation. The other thing that's happened is in January, in parallel with that, the township started the first activities related to the second set of modules that will go live, and that's payroll HR. So there's sessions for that going on in parallel as well, and that's targeted for implementation on January 1st. So it's going to be a busy year for the township administration. But at the end of the year, have not only the financial system, but the payroll HR system up. Then there's other modules to follow for the next, year and a half, 2 years, I guess, as well as there's a lot of things where even in the initial implementations, the township's not necessarily taking advantage immediately of all the features and functions of the system. And those are things they can implement, as the system goes live and they get used to it. Once the old system's cut off, then they can think about doing some new stuff. One example would be doing electronic payments or EFT payments. Right now the township pays all the checks with written checks. Certainly not another thing they want to add into the implementation right now, but that's just one of a whole long list of features that the township can implement anytime after they go live, and certainly one of the things they'll be looking at. But again, that's just one example of a long list. So I guess that's the report. Bill, anything you want to add or any questions?
Yeah, well, just in jest mostly, but the folks that we have in finance that are doing the day-to-day implementation deserve a ton of credit. Because right now, not only are they doing these implementation requirements, but they're also doing their day-to-day jobs. And the way that the plan is for the implementation is these are all-day sessions, so 9 to 4. And usually for traveling and for efficiency purposes, they lump them together into 3 or 4 days in a row. And so there have been periods over the last 2 months where we've had 3 to 4 days of all-day implementation sessions. And in spite of that, they have been able to keep up with everything they have to do with, whether it's doing the stormwater bills in January, getting ready to do the real estate tax bills now, or doing the payroll. Jerry didn't mention the fact that our Penimation server crashed on us at the beginning of January, so there was 2 weeks there where I was more nervous than probably anyone. They just kind of sat down and got to work and did a fantastic job. We actually did our first payroll of 2017 by hand, and then subsequently went back and put it into the database once it was revived off of the operating table. So I just, the staff deserves a ton of credit because they are, and when I say staff, there's 4 or 5 people that are doing this, and they deserve a ton of credit for what, getting this project, keeping it on track, and at the same time doing their day-to-day job. So thank you to them. And if they string me up here in a couple of weeks, I will have deserved it for putting them through this.
Thank you, Bill. How's morale? I mean, is it?
Overall it's good, and I'm not kidding now when I say that the staff that we have in finance are problem-solving folks. So that when an example is when the server crashed in January, we got together as a group, and to a person, they each said, "All right, what do I need to do to make sure that there's no interruption to service or no interruption in accounting controls, financial reporting, everything from the nitty-gritty details to the highest level of reporting that we are required to do." So that's a real quick description of the folks that are in the department. So they take all this in stride. I think for the most part, they see at the end of the day the improvements that will occur both in terms of operational efficiencies as well as making it a little bit easier for our stakeholders to do business with the township. They realize that those benefits are out there, which helps keep everyone on track. Plus, we're all very aware that the current system that we're on was not something that was sustainable anyway. So change was inevitable and mandatory, which kind of helped push everyone off the ledge and get us going. So, but I can't say enough complimentary things about all of the folks in the finance department who are making this happen.
Thank you. And just a quick follow-up question for you, Jerry, because this is a massive undertaking. I think the budget was $1 million for this. And many times when there's implementation of that scale, there are problems or delays or whatever. And how is this project going? You're an expert in these matters so far, compared to some of the disasters that we might have read about in the paper or whatever.
Yeah, no, I mean, everything sounds great. I mean, we have access to all the project reports, the project plan details and so forth. There's certainly issues are coming up and they're being recognized and dealt with. We asked some questions about the conversion approach and some questions about, falling back if there's an issue, with implementation. So, we're asking those questions and those things have been thought through. So, everything looks like it's good to go.
Well, I'm relieved to hear that. Thank you for sharing. All right. Well, that's the end of our project updates. So next on the agenda is one of our standing responsibilities, commitments to the board, and that is to review the quarterly financials, in this case, the year-end financials. And Bill is going to lead us through this presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, so normally, and this is a month late. Normally, we would have done this at the last meeting, but I had a conflict and was unable to attend. So I appreciate everyone's patience and allowing me to catch up this month. This is a report that the Board of Commissioners have already seen. I think when we get back to the normal cadence, CARFAC will get to see these quarterly updates first, and then they'll be reported to the commissioners. But this was presented to the Board of Commissioners at their February 13th meeting. I think our April meeting, CARFAC's April meeting, there'll be the first quarter of 2017 report to step through. So again, this is the fourth quarter of 2016. I know it seems like a long time ago. But what we'll do is we'll step through the general fund, how the revenues and expenses did on the full year basis. We'll also take a look at the sanitary sewer and the stormwater funds. There won't be much change. There won't be changes in the sanitary and stormwater because most of that activity is in the first quarter of the year on the revenue side anyway. But we'll show how we did on the full year. And then we'll also take a look at the pension investment performance, how it did in 2016. So on an aggregate level, the general fund revenues ended within 0.2% of the budgeted amounts, which is always nice when we get it that close. But that was achieved through mixed results in the different areas. Real estate taxes, that is the most predictable form of revenue that the township gets. Even during the recession back in 2008 and 9, the real estate tax revenues basically hit their marks then. That's one of the complements of the Radnor's economic strength, is those revenues are spot on and easy to predict. We've had other areas, development and recreation, that did very well. They far exceeded their expectations. Police enforcement revenues fell short by a substantial percentage. In terms of the overall revenue, it's not as significant, but it's still something that we wanted to report on. And then there was a lot of discussion with the commissioners then about how the business privilege and mercantile did. There was actually a year-over-year decline of 1%, which was compounded by the fact that we were counting on or budgeting for roughly a 4% increase. So there was a pretty large variance created there. A lot of that was offset, not all of it, but a lot of it was offset by the audit revenues in both of those areas, which helped make up for some of the shortfall. On the expense side, we ended about a 1.5% below budgeted amounts. Admin finance, we had legal expenses that exceeded expectations. Those are the same variances that we've been reporting on all year. They continued again in the fourth quarter. We were able to realize, in some cases, some significant savings in both police and public works due to some vacant positions. And then ever since the first quarter of 16, we were reporting that the mild winter from a year ago saved the public works department quite a bit throughout the year. Then at the end of the year, based on the allocation of the excess fund balances through the transfers, those appear to be a large variance or outflow of cash. But it was something that was planned or discussed and approved at the end of the year. We don't necessarily budget for those, so on a budget versus actual analysis, they look like variances. But again, that's distribution of prior year's excess revenues, which is a good thing to have versus the alternative. Yep.
The police enforcement revenues, what caused that? I know it's not significant, but I'm just curious, what comprised that?
In my opinion, it was a situation more of being a little bit too aggressive with our estimates, thinking that enforcement would generate more revenue than it is actually able to.
But what area of enforcement were you looking at?
Overall, so police would include any kind of moving traffic violations, parking, That's basic. I mean, the moving violations is the primary area, and then parking would be the other one.
So-
And that's parking enforcement, not parking revenue. Those are two different
right,
things.
Could you comment on parking revenue with the kiosks as comparison to parking revenue? And that'd be net revenue. So, the cost of people collecting the coinage previously versus the cost of the servicing of the kiosks.
So I can talk on a gross level, because we don't yet have the accounting set up to where I can net those costs out easily. That's a whole nother analysis that is not easy to do with the way we're set up now. On the new software, and I'll digress for a moment and then get back on track, but under the new software, we actually created a parking division, or it's called an organization. And the new software allows us to align revenues and expenses under a unique organization code so that we can easily report on that organization. So Act 511 will be the same way. Parking is another way where we'll be able to quickly look at the revenues generated under parking as well as all the expenses that are directly associated with that program and be able to answer a net question very easily. On the aggregate, in terms of parking revenue, we saw an increase. I don't have the exact information other than to say that it wasn't quite at the level that we thought it would be, for a couple of very identifiable reasons. First, when the kiosks were installed, it was discussed and decided publicly that at the end of every transaction, there'd be a 10-minute free time period. The discussion was more of a comparison to Lower Merion in that there's a button that you hit for a free 10 minutes at the beginning. The kiosk software didn't allow that, so the compromise was you're able to get 10 minutes free at the end. So that extended parking without payment. So that was new. The meters that we had prior did not have that feature. So that ate into a little bit of the revenues. The other aspect of why those revenues didn't grow quite at the rate is for the first part of last year, there were still a lot of learning curve situations going on with the parking where folks were, the police department was understanding and where folks didn't necessarily follow the procedures exactly. By the end of the year, I think, for the most part, users have learned the new system, and revenues kind of indicated that toward the end of the year. But so in total, parking revenue itself was up versus what it was with the meters in years past.
Even with the free 10 minutes, that should be well overcome by the fact that you have no lost time. So with a traditional meter, someone puts in for an hour and pulls out within 40 minutes, the next person pulls in and steals their 20 minutes. And with this system, you have a lot of double dipping on the same spot where the person has left time on the meter, the new person comes in, is unaware of that and has to pay, which is fair, but theoretically that should well cover that piece.
Yeah, and I'm going off of memory, and that was discussed when the kiosks were approved, and I want to say that the percentage was roughly 10 to 15% increase in revenue based on that situation. In our first year with the kiosks, we did not achieve that level, but that's something that moving forward we may very well.
And the relationship with the app Whoosh, I think there's a service fee borne by the parker. Is the township incurring any fee for that, or is their revenue come from the service fee borne by the parker?
So the additional fee that the parker pays for that service goes directly to the Whoosh. That's paying for the opportunity to pay for parking remotely without having to go back to the kiosk. So that is not a cost that the township is incurring. That was part of the discussion when the service was first introduced, is whether or not the township was willing to incur those. Our position was no. That would be the cost of that service would be borne by the user, and so that's the way it was ultimately approved and set up.
Bill, with this cost of the kiosks and the anticipated increased revenue, what's the payback on the increased revenue relative to the cost of incurring? Is it 5 years, 10 years? Was that analysis ever done?
No, there was no rate of return analysis done when the kiosks were installed. And it's funny, Mary and I were talking earlier when we were taking a look at the financial metrics. I'm not discounting the importance of the analysis. It would certainly be fun to do and maybe insightful with future decisions. But typically in government programs, the financial bottom line is not the sole reason for moving forward with the program. So I can tell you that the kiosk costs roughly $450,000. Parking revenue in any given year is going to be roughly $500,000. So $500,000 in total. The only numbers I have are the 1 year with the kiosks. That may bump up a little bit, but if it bumps up by 10%, then the math of 50,000 into 450 without taking time value of money into it is going to be, they have calculators for that. And on live TV, I've already proven in several commissioner meetings that math in my head is not a good idea. So
One last thing.
it'll be years and years.
This year is the mild winters. I'm just curious. Is this winter today considered to be milder than last year's winter or on par?
Well, we were looking really good until about 48 hours ago. And we did have the blizzard that hit at the end of February a year ago that took a bite out of the budget. But in total, of all 3 months of the winter, we were in much better shape. And so far this year, we're in the same position. We had 1 day of snow. And unlike, I joke with our public works guys all the time. They probably don't think it's as funny as I do, but it only seemed to snow from Friday after 3:30 p.m. and before Monday at 7:30 a.m. So it was all overtime and it was all salt. But at least on Tuesday, it was during normal working hours, and it was mostly plowing. It wasn't a great deal of salt, but. Like I said, I think that's a lot funnier than they do, but I think so far I don't have the exact numbers from this week yet, but we were doing pretty good. Yeah, well, the first quarter numbers that I report on next month will have how we're doing on most of that.
Bill, one other thing, just circling back to the police enforcement revenues. The dollar amount was down, but do you have an insight as to the number of incidents? Did they decline? Is that part of what were the factors there?
Yeah. We have, in terms of the parking enforcement, we have all of that data. And the enforcement itself was not off. That's why I said I forget who first asked what were the reasons why that would have been down. And that's why my opinion is that we missed our target not because of activity, but because we budgeted too aggressively on the revenue side. So actually, when we put our 17 budget together, we pulled that estimate back a little bit to reflect that and try to be more realistic with what we think that revenue should be. And again, I mean, without getting into all the details of the budget meetings, when we're talking about enforcement of any kind, it's a balance between good enforcement and over-enforcement. So that's the balance that the police department is trying to strike. And so we probably budgeted based on maybe a little bit of over-enforcement, and the reality was something a little bit more realistic. So
I guess what I'm getting at, one aspect of it is with respect to moving violations and DUIs and things like that, are we becoming more compliant? Are people being less reckless, or however you want to characterize that, or surveillance was down or up? I'm just curious.
So those are good questions, and I think we do not right now do a lot of non-financial data collecting and analysis. Most of that analysis is done by finance, and usually there's a dollar amount or dollar sign attached to it. When we have all of that data housed under one source, it'll be easier to pull from. Right now, they're all in satellite databases, and the work required to pull it just hasn't been asked for yet. But I think in the long, as we go forward, the activity behind the numbers will be something that we'll be able to report on to answer that question specifically. But since you brought it up, I think it's also important to point out that when it comes to the moving violations, and I don't know if the Citizens Police Academy got into this kind of detail with it, but if you get a speeding ticket in Radnor and pay 100, I haven't gotten one yet, but $120, let's say, Radnor Township gets about 15 of those dollars. The rest is going to the state. So that there's not a whole lot of financial incentive for the township to really be out there monitoring traffic. Now that's coming from the finance director. The police chief would have a totally different opinion on that, appropriately so, because at the end of the day, it's about the safety.
Every township does the same thing, Lower Merion,
Yeah,
different?
yeah. The state is the primary benefactor of those moving violations.
Will the creation of the Villanova University Police Department affect the police enforcement revenues?
Not at all, no. The enforcement that Villanova's police will have is going to be primarily within their own borders, and those were not, those incidences were not revenue generating incidents. They were mostly other types of incidents. College students and, the fun that they have sometimes. And it's very clear in the memorandum of understanding that the Villanova police are not out enforcing moving violations on the public streets as well. That's still Radnor Township Police enforcing that. So to the extent we are ticketing for those, that'll be, the $15 will come to the township. All right, we'll get into a little bit more of the detail. So we have one of these slides for each of the major revenue sources for the general fund. This is on the aggregate, so this is the whole general fund. As you can see, the full year budget was a little over 34 million. Our actual was 34.1 with the 57,000 variance. I identify under the key points some of the bigger reasons why, or the bigger areas where things were either up or down. But again, on the aggregate, the revenues performed right where we expected them to. The other part about this slide that's helpful is to gain an understanding of how much revenue we're talking about. And the general fund generates a little over 34 million in revenue in a whole year. On the general fund expenditure side, again, this is the aggregate. This is all general fund expenditures. What I exclude from this total are the transfers out to other funds, because as I mentioned in the summary section, those aren't necessarily a good indicator of financial performance, because in December of 16, we transferred out over $1 million of excess revenues realized at the end of 15. So I didn't want to capture those as actual expenses in 2016. So what you're looking at here, the 28.7 budgeted, is operating expenditures in the general fund. At the end of the day, when you include all the transfers, the total amount that leaves the general fund was slightly less than the amount that came in. But on the operational expenditure side, there was also the positive variance. The summary section was 1.5% positive variance. This slide rounded that up to 2. But again, it identifies some of those, some of the bigger factors that led to the being under budget.
It would seem to me, on this general level, that the management team has done an excellent job of budgeting here and planning. You're virtually spot on.
Well, I appreciate that. And when things roll up to its highest level, that's where we're really managing the expenses at, or at least I am. Department by department, they manage them on a line item basis. And I will say, and I say it in our budget meetings and our finance meetings internally, so I'm not saying anything that they haven't heard, but we do much better in some areas than we do others. But on the aggregate, the numbers are where the board said they wanted to see them at. So that is good. I won't go into a whole lot of detail unless you have specific questions, but we'll get into some of the more particular areas of the revenue grouping. So the real estate tax, as I talked about, are very easy to predict. They come in as anticipated. Really, the only variances that exist are on the very slight number of folks who do not pay versus those who had not paid in prior years who catch up. And so that's where we would get a variance, and that's why that's usually very, very small. We report it in the statistical section of our CAFR what the annual collections are, and they're upwards of 99% year over year. You'll see if you look in the CAFR, some years are over 100%. That's where there's a collection from someone who's previously delinquent. But real estate taxes were right on the mark.
Bill, does this include transfer tax as well?
No, this is just the real estate tax, the 3.9, the millage just left my brain, but it's the township's millage, something. So this is, the next grouping is the Act 511 taxes, which does include the realty transfer tax is part of this grouping. Which is probably, so this group does include the realty transfer tax. It includes the business privilege. It includes the mercantile LST, which stands for the local services tax. And then it also includes any of the audit proceeds from the enforcement of those taxes. And as you can see, as we talked about earlier, there was the variance created as a result of the regular tax revenue, which was offset by better than expected audit proceeds on the business privilege and mercantile side. And there's one more bullet there. It's worth noting because it was a point of some lengthy discussions when this presentation was given to the board. There was a great deal of concern raised over why BPT had what was deemed as a bad year. Yes, while it's not ideal that BPT didn't grow at its normal 6 to 8% per year growth rate, if you take a step back and you look at that revenue since the recession, it has been extremely strong. And it's something that, as a group, we've looked at, and it's actually been able to fund a lot of the initiatives, including our pay-as-you-go capital, our OPEB funding plan, and a significant amount of excess revenues that have been deposited into the 2 pension plans as a result of the growth over the years. So BPT had a bad 16, but that's one bad year after 6 really, really good years. So, and it also, the other point that we talked about in the board presentation is it demonstrates just how difficult it is to predict the revenue, because we really don't have a lot of data or insight into what that revenue might look like in the future, because obviously past performance is no indicator of how things will look in the future.
Bill, excuse me. Is the BPT the item where the actual numbers were down 1% and the forecast guess was up 4%, and so that explains the variance there?
Yes, and then the audit revenues were pretty strong over what we had estimated, which helped offset some of that negative variance.
Right, but just in terms of, when you think of the business privilege tax, there wasn't migration out or businesses leaving. It's more of a leveling off in terms of the activity, not something to be concerned about. Is that accurate?
So that's part of what came out of our discussion with the commissioners, is that's an analysis that we're going back into the accounting software we have specific to Act 511 and trying to pull out information that might provide some insight there. We haven't had a chance to put that analysis together. Again, it's a factor of the one, that would be something we'd ask Bob Tate to do. And Bob is, I'm not making an excuse, but he just finished up negotiations with 2 of the unions. He is doing the software implementation. He's also leading up the audit. So this is on his list. I've just told him that this will be something we'll get to maybe in the summer months when he's not upside down. So, but the goal is at the end of this to have information pulled from that accounting software that does provide some insight into that.
Yes, I think that would be something that when we get around to the stakeholders report, that would be something that we'd want to let the public know about in terms of the business environment here and whether it's thriving or, what the situation is, what we can interpret from the numbers.
Sure.
So that'd be
Yeah,
good.
what we'll be able to get out of the system are the number of filers. We are required with our CAFR to present the top 10. We don't present them by business name. We present them by business category, again, because of taxpayer confidentiality. So we have some of those statistics right off the top that we can pull from. We're hoping that maybe we can get in there a little deeper by business industry, see if there's anything that pops out at us there. But it is something that we're going to work on.
Bill, were there any changes done in the 2017 budget to kind of temper our expectations in terms of year-to-year growth based on the information we had, probably like third quarter last year, which is probably when the budget was put together?
Yeah, and I think in an ideal budgeting world, more of a rolling budget would help us do that. But the way our charter requires us to budget is, it puts us in a situation where we come up with the 2017 estimates based on what we think 16 might end up at. So we're budgeting off of budgets. So actually the way it turned out is while we went in with a more conservative growth estimate on what we thought we were going to get, we came in under what we thought we were going to get. So now it looks like we're being very aggressive with 17. So it's something that after May, when we have the actuals in, that we can go back and evaluate. So I can tell you that our goal was to temper those expectations, but being that 16 came in as under the expectations the way they did, now it looks like our growth estimate is right back up there at 4, 5, 6%. And that wasn't our intent. Again, that's something that legally we have to put those budgets together, but ideally more of a rolling forecast would help us correct those kind of blips moving forward.
Thanks for the explanation.
The last category is all others. And the reason why we identify the revenues into those 3 buckets is it's in the prior stakeholder reports from CARFAC, it's in our budget, that we take the revenue and we basically break it off into 3 pieces. And that is to allow us to identify the real estate taxes by themselves, Act 511 taxes by themselves, and then everything else. And at the time, it was roughly 3 equal pieces. Now, since then, the business tax has grown faster, which now they are considerably larger than this piece, which is about 7.1 million. But that's why we broke it up into those 3 broad categories. This includes all of our permitting, interest, enforcement, and departmental type revenues. As you can see by the key points, some of the areas did really well. We identified the police enforcement missing its mark. Cable franchise missed its mark too by 52,000. That isn't necessarily one I would throw red flags up at, but it was a big enough number that I wanted to report on it. That's another one that, as long as people are buying cable, that'll be a solid revenue number. But as alternatives to cable continue to present themselves, that might be something that is that we start pulling our revenue estimates back on.
What were the percentages of the 259 and 52? What percentage did it represent?
Percentage of total expenses, or percentage of what they were otherwise budgeted at? Yeah. So for the police enforcement, it was about 33%. I don't have the cable franchise memorized because it wasn't included in the summary section, but it would be a much smaller percentage. But in total, this group did much better than expected by almost 400,000 on the aggregate. Switching gears on the expense side. So we have these categorized in their groupings as defined by our CAFR, our annual report, and those are defined by GASB, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. So the general government group for Radnor includes our administration, finance, treasurer, and IT departments. As I mentioned in the summary for administration and finance, we had higher than expected legal costs. On the administration side, it's the legal expenses that were higher than expected dealt mostly with litigation and paying our solicitor for suits brought against the township. It's not something we have a great deal of control over, but at the same time, it is very expensive. On the finance side, the 100% of our legal costs that are charged deal in our enforcement of the Act 511, either through the audit, the auditor, and the solicitor that we pay as we enforce that tax. The one thing I'll mention, and this group's aware of it, is that all of those costs that we're incurring for the audit and the legal are made up for in the revenues generated. One of the things that we're identifying within the department is a target, some sort of ratio, positive ratio of revenue to audit expense, and then use that as some sort of benchmark to track it over time. I will say that last year the net audit revenue was not as high as it had been in prior years because of the new agreement we have with the auditor. We had several large auditing amounts that were generated, which, as a result of the agreement with the auditor, generated some additional expense to him. So that drove the expense up and made it a little bit higher than what we had budgeted. And then the treasurer and IT side, given the amounts of the expense, the variances were not anything that we were overly alarmed with. Protections to persons and property. This includes, obviously the biggest one's police, but it also includes our community development, which enforces all the township property codes and building codes. And then this also includes our contributions to the fire companies as well as our emergency operations center. As you can see, with regard to community development and police, they both ended with positive variances. With regard to the police one, I'll note that positive variance was a pretty drastic change over the first 3 quarters. We were projecting a healthy negative variance there, mostly due to a workers' comp settlement payment that was made in the first quarter of last year. By the end of the year, we had a vacant police position, as well as a couple vacancies in their part-time areas that generated enough savings to more than offset the cost of that settlement. And then with regard to the negative variances on the fire operations, emergency operations center, the fire operations, the negative variance there. Part of what we lump under that category is our the hydrant water. It's more of a utility than it is a contribution to a fire company. That was a little bit higher, as was the insurances that we pay for the Radnor Fire Company. We insure all the vehicles as well as their workman's comp. The Emergency Operations Center, the $281,000 there includes the blizzard costs from last February, as well as about $40,000 in costs for Villanova's Final Four championship. And Villanova did reimburse for 100% of the township's overtime costs related to that. The revenues are not recognized here on the expense side. We show that in the revenue category, but they did pay for their share of those costs.
Bill, was that a voluntary reimbursement? You know, kind of going with the pilot question again.
Some yes and some no. Villanova is by far the biggest user of our police department. We call it extra duty. That's when they have any kind of special event. They are required, this is not a voluntary, they are required to hire a police officer to manage traffic, to run the signals, or any list of extra duty details that are required by whatever event they're having. So there was a certain amount of required police detail, but obviously given the magnitude, every police department in the area came in to help, and there were hundreds and hundreds of police officers from surrounding municipalities. Quite honestly, I'm not sure if Villanova had to pay it, but in terms of the court of public opinion, they had to pay it, and they did. And they did it timely, to their credit.
Bill, just
So hopefully in 2 weeks, we'll have the same problem.
yes, that'd be great. Just a quick question on the overall design of that chart. The first column, target percent, it's 100% on all of these. What does that mean?
So, yeah, I guess in the fourth quarter, that column kind of loses its relevance. So in, say, the first quarter, what that column is intended to do is capture some seasonality to some of the numbers. So more so on the revenue side provides a much better example. So we do the stormwater billing in January. So we have, by the end of the first quarter, we would expect to collect 98% of the full year's revenue for stormwater. So the target percentage for that will say 98. What you're seeing here is by the end of the year, we will have expected 100% in all of these categories. So that's where the fourth quarter kind of loses its relevance. Next month, when we're looking at the first quarter, that'll mean a little bit more. For the most part, expenses will be roughly 25%. But again, there are some departments where they have higher costs in the first quarter or lower. So we try to recognize that when we identify that target percent. Because that percent is what drives the year-to-date target number a couple columns over.
Thank you.
The Public Works Group, every single division within this group was below budget. When we say that the highway, or that we had a mild winter, which helped save money, that 188 and some change in the variance column for the highway division, that's what we're referring to for the most part. The other variances were a mix of a lot of different factors, both payroll and non-payroll related. But again, at the end of the day, when we're taking a look at our line item budgets, these are some of the areas that we did better in than others. And I will note real quickly that the engineering, it's a little bit different. The accounting for that is treated a little bit different than other departments because so much of our engineering costs are reimbursed through development escrows that we report our engineering costs net of the escrow activity. And again, we do that because basically the township is serving as a pass-through. We are required to mandate code compliance with development, and we're mandating that those who are doing development pay for those professional services so that the general taxpayer is not picking up the bill. And so we pull that activity out of the engineering department and report just what the township's cost for that department is. Parks and Recreation, this is another grouping that was all under budget for the year. The large variance in park maintenance dealt mostly with the fact that we have a couple of vacancies that came up throughout the year. We had a retirement, and another gentleman physically have to retire. And those positions just weren't filled right away, so it created the positive variance. The last category, we call it all other, but we identify what they are in the line items. We have the library, the township's contributions to the various community organizations, and then we have our insurance and retiree benefit group. And then the other is just the township's cost for paying agents on our bonds. But it's a very, very small amount. As you can see that we were under budget. The under budget on the library, I pointed this out to the board, it's worth mentioning here that the positive variance there is in addition to the monthly contributions we give the library, we also budget for repair and maintenance costs at the building itself. Last year there wasn't a lot of repair and maintenance at the building because we have a major construction project going on. So that generated a positive variance there. In any of the areas where we the township contribute funding to the organization, we always spend 100% of it. There's no variance there ever. So under the community organizations where you see a negative variance, that's actually the result of an accounting change that I reported on at the end of the third period, where we have revenue sharing agreements with the Wayne Business Association as well as the Wayne Presbyterian Church. The Wayne Presbyterian Church is actually a land share agreement where it's their land, but we have the parking kiosks on the land. We use the land for parking in Wayne. We share 50% of the revenues. Prior to the second quarter of this year, we would net the revenue sharing out of the revenue number. So I decided to change that and keep the revenue number gross and account for the expense within the community organization accounting group. We can always net the numbers together when we compare them together, but we keep the revenues pure and we keep the expenses pure. So now we could see within a line item in our budget how much it costs to have that agreement. But we didn't budget that way when we put the 16 budget together, so it generated a negative variance. But if you compare the revenues and expenses, that $44,000 is sitting up in the parking revenue as a positive variance. The insurance and retiree benefit positive variance is the result of healthcare savings throughout the year. We budget, when we put the budget together for that, we budget based on the number of retirees we have at that time receiving health care throughout the year. If we have a retiree who passes away during the year, that's what generates any kind of positive variance there.
Bill, before you go on off the general fund, do you have a sense of, if you net the two things out, the revenue variance, the expenditure variance, any projection on what the general fund surplus would look like coming out of 15? And I forget, on the original budget, I forget what was budgeted. I know it wasn't significant. I forget if it was a slight deficit or a slight surplus, but whatever was originally projected plus the variance.
Yeah, bear with me a second. Let me open up this spreadsheet. I can give you a little bit more precise number than an estimate. So in about 4 months, when you ask this question, I'm going to be pulling up Tyler Munis and looking that up instead of Microsoft Excel. But what we're looking at is, this is obviously set up now for 2017, but we can look in the 2016 column and see that after we made all the transfers for the excess fund balances, it actually shows a reduction in fund balance, which kind of makes sense because we weren't planning on allocating all that cash when we put the budget together. So it would make sense that that would drop down. So really what that's telling us is that the amount we allocated from the 15 excess was greater than the surplus actually generated in 16. And with a little bit of time, I could put an exact number together.
I mean, just roughly, though, I mean, if you net out the revenue variance, the expenditure variance, I thought it looked like somewhere on the order of maybe $500,000 or something.
It might be a little bit higher than that, but yeah, in the presentation, yeah. So if you take, oh, you guys don't, you're not looking at what I'm looking at. Again, this is live television, so I'm looking at a split screen that's not splitting. Boy, it does not like when I do that. Sorry. I'm trying to get back up to that expenditure variance, which is about 460-some thousand.
Right.
If you add that to the 50-some thousand revenue variance, you get the $500,000.
Right, right. But, and, I mean, the other point is it's significantly less than the surplus that was available at the end of 15.
Yes.
And I think even what was allocated at, what was allocated with the remainder at 15, wasn't that actually 14 carried forward plus 15? Wasn't it the 14 surplus and the 15 surplus together that was available, I think?
Yes, because we did not have a specific allocation of 14's excess.
Right,
So that would have accumulated into the 15.
right, right. So, I mean, the key thing is that the opportunity to do what was done at the end of last year with allocating some of those surpluses, that was the result of 2 years, and for 16, it looks like even the 1 year in 16 won't be even what just came out of 15 itself. So,
Right.
so that
Yep.
from a first guess or first look, that same opportunity won't be there in thinking about budgeting for 18.
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and if I had to identify why, it goes back, and we've talked about it in detail with some of our projects. What was generating those large surpluses or excess revenues in prior years was the unexpected growth of the business privilege and mercantile tax. And we did not realize that in 16, and you see that excess fall sharply as a result.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Let me see if I can figure out how to get this thing to cooperate now. There we go. All right, so we were about to jump to our sewer fund, which I always try to qualify as the sanitary sewer fund because sometimes sewer can be either stormwater and or sanitary. But in this case, this is our sanitary sewer fund. This accounts for the sewer rent that all the properties that are hooked up to the system pay for in Radnor. Similar to the real estate and the stormwater, this is a one-time bill. So all the collections occur within at the end of the first quarter into the second quarter. And there was a negative variance of $480,000 from what we estimated. And the reason for this is actually, we do know that the source of this variance is water consumption was not what we based the revenue estimate to be on. If you don't know, the sanitary sewer bill is, the township has a fixed rate that's set by the Board of Commissioners. It's been at $5.90 per 1,000 gallons of water used. It's been at that rate for several years now. So any kind of fluctuation in the total revenue, being that the pricing is fixed, is going to be water consumption. And water consumption in Radnor for the few years has been pretty stagnant. So while we estimate a little bit higher water consumption year over year. Actual revenues have not proven that out. The one thing with this is that our single largest expense or use of the sanitary sewer revenue is our payment, the township's payment to the RHM Sewer Authority. That basically is a collection of Radnor, Haverford, and Marple townships, the RHM. Those three communities came together and created this, created RHM, and we pay them to manage the flow of the sanitary water downstream. So we pay them roughly $4 million out of the 5.3 that is collected. Their bill to each of the three entities is also based on flow. So there's a direct relationship between water consumption and how much we end up paying RHM, which helps. So if we have a negative revenue variance, usually there's, not usually, there is a positive expense variance. It's not necessarily dollar for dollar, but it does help offset some of that revenue, missed revenue. In addition to that, because we knew the revenue variance was going to be large, we also pulled back on some discretionary administrative things that we would have otherwise done with the sewer system. Some of the maintenance items that we have at pumping stations, and we held off on some of the capital costs that we had budgeted for that year. So we were able to generate a positive variance on the expense side to help offset the loss in revenue, or the, not loss in revenue, but the missed expectation. The last fund that we'll take a look at real quickly is stormwater. This is the fee that was created, I think this was the 4th year that we had billed. And in each of the years, the collections have been exactly what we thought they would be, with a very, very high collection rate. So on the expense side, it's a little bit more of a political process on how that's going, but on the revenue side, it's performing very, very well in generating the revenue that it was expected to for its purpose. So finally, the last piece of this is the how the pensions did in 2000. Oh, sure.
You have no expense information on that?
I don't. I could add it. Quite honestly, there's a stormwater management advisory committee similar to CARFAC that oversees all the expenses of the stormwater fund. So it's not really something that we have a whole lot of input on.
Well, you know, usually when you're looking at revenues, you look at expenses, and I think it would be illuminating, not just for us, but the public, to know the money's coming in, what's happening to it.
Yeah, for the stormwater fund, for the most part, they're just collecting in the fund. We've had a couple projects over the years, but that's what I was referring to from the more the political side, is determining the prioritization of projects, and that's just taken a little bit longer. But I could certainly add that. It's not a problem to add. On the pension markets, the performance side, there's 2 graphs that are included. First, we have information going all the way back to the inception of our agreement with PFM, which was late 1995, how the annual returns for each of the funds, what the percentage return was for that year. There are 2 lines there, not surprisingly, since both pension funds are managed with the same set of rules, that their performance tracks right on top of one another. When I say there's 2, there's a civilian and a police pension fund. We provided this slide just to give a long-term historical input on the annual returns. The green line represents what the target was at In the interest of full disclosure, the more recent years, this line is accurate. The further back we go, we're not, the information that tells us what exactly the assumption was isn't readily available. It's going to take a lot more digging. So I just put the line all the way back to 95. Maybe a more accurate way to reflect this is to cut the line off, say at 2009, or as far back as we can go with accuracy. But it, at any rate, gives you an idea of what the target is versus where the actual returns are year over year. The graph, the pension fund investment returns for just 2016 shows a monthly look at how those funds did for each of the months of the year, and then how that compared to the 7.5% target that we had for 2016. As you can see, for the funds in aggregate missed the 7.5% by roughly 1.25%. We ended the year at 6.23% growth. I think as part of the, as Jerry had touched on in his summary of the long-term liabilities project, is we're going to be taking this information and putting a lot more context with it to help it tell us more about what's going on. For purposes of this slide, what I could say is that because we missed the 7.5% target for 2016 in our next valuation that we're going to be doing later this year, that will be dated 1/1/2017, there will be a new actuarial loss for the amounts that weren't generated by the market that will then be added to the township's annual pension expense. That loss is amortized over roughly 15 to 18 years. The length of that is determined by the length of the plan. It's not a fixed set number. So, and it goes to what we've talked about in our project discussions, and ever since we really were looking at this going back to 2011, is that these assumptions have a direct impact to the township's operating statement in terms of expense. So for 16, we'll see the MMO tick up a little bit. If you use interest rates or net present value calculations that were consistent with other recent actuarial losses, that miss of roughly 1.25% will generate an increase of about $58,000 in our MMO over the next, again, 15 to 18 years.
Yeah. Bill, there's another key point here. So that's for 2016. I think I'm right about this, that the next valuation, like we talked about earlier, it's biennial, it's every 2 years. So that'll also pick up the variance in the return versus the assumption for 2015 as well, which was more dramatic. As I recall, that was basically a flat return, no return against the 7.5 target. So when you put the two together, it would be even a more dramatic effect that we'll see in the next valuation.
Yeah, so to demonstrate your point, I don't know if they could see it on TV, but I'm circling how 2015 did. And it was right at the zero line. So that will be a much more dramatic missed assumption and increased expense to the MMO.
So it's worth remembering for those of you that may not readily recall the numbers, and validate me, Mark, given that you see these numbers every day as well. So 2015 was a year where equities had a negative return, actually below 1% negative, and bonds in aggregate had a positive return, also below 1%. If you add in a 60-40 portfolio, the bonds helped, sort of smooth the bumps a little bit, but not that much, because, basically both types of assets return essentially zero for all intents and purposes. So.
Right, but I mean, I would have thought that in terms of balancing the portfolio, you would have had some GIC in there. You would have had some fixed income, so at least you'd get some return, as opposed to bonds and equities. I think given the volatility in the marketplace, a lot of I've seen other entities looking at, maybe allocating a portion of the money to a fixed income type investment, so there at least is some guaranteed return as opposed to zero. So, I mean, I just wonder about this investment advisor, and I don't know what kind of fees we're paying them, but, I'll put it out there. I think that we might want to consider, looking at some other folks. Because it seems to me that that would have been a pretty prudent thing to do.
Bill, what about the years where you exceed the target? Is there a improvement that, or a reduction? Yeah.
Yeah, it works the same way. So if returns are greater than 7.5%, there's an actuarial gain, and the actuarial treatment's the same as a loss. So that gain is spread out over the same amortization period that a loss would be, and you would see a reduction in the MMO.
So just one last thing on this. As part of the subcommittee meeting we talked about a couple of things. One is the chart on the left with all the ups and downs over the 20 years, trying to look at that on, what's that net out to on a average annual return or compound annual return basis, so we can net that all out against what the target is. And then also even talked about, even on a shorter time horizon, but rather than just looking at the 1 year, looking at 1, 5, 10 years, what's our rolling average annual return, to try to take some of the volatility out of it and see how we're doing over a longer term, and maybe even on a for the pension fund, maybe even 20-year, 30-year is relevant as well. So we talked about trying to take a little, try to distill this down to some of the longer term returns, but looking at them on a rolling basis.
Yeah. One more thing on this topic, Jerry, and everyone. I know it's a political choice that has to be made by the leaders of the community, the commissioners, but from a financial standpoint, with the 7.5% expectation there, not being able to meet that or exceed it with regularity gives us the volatility, in this case $58,000. And lowering that to, say, 7.25 or 7.5 voluntarily or formally would increase the expected contribution that we could plan for more readily. Might require some adjustment in tax rates or something, but even if we were to lower it to, say, 7, one of the items that came out of the study that we did last year was that for the next 5 to 10 years, the median expected return is like 5.5%. And of course, who knows what will happen? 20% up 1 year, whatever, but in terms of just trying to help the commissioners understand likely scenarios, we're at 7.5 now, so that would suggest a 2-point spread over the median expectation. So we know that adjustments are likely to be coming. And so a decision point for the commissioners might be, do we ratchet that down a bit and just kind of anticipate the expected additional contributions and plan for them that way, knowing that we would still probably get some volatility with the additional increase, because if we took it down to 5.5% or 6 or something, the increase in the annual contribution would be so great as to crowd out other expenditures in our budget. So that would not work. But I think that's a sophisticated point with a lot of nuances that we hope to communicate to the board later this year.
Yeah, no, that's right. Along with some other related issues too, about how you, because that translates into the MMO, the municipal minimum obligation, which, becomes a significant budget item, and it becomes a significant budget item. That's been eating up a lot of the increase in revenues that we talked about with the BPT. So, the idea is getting some control over it, because when it hits, if you're right at the minimum requirement, which we've been doing now, when it hits, you've got no choice. as opposed to being in a position to have some control over absorbing it. But, you know, that's where finance meets politics that we'll see starting in the summer, I guess.
Absolutely. So we can just provide the insights, and then they, of course, have to make the decisions. But
Right, right. But I think, you know, the point is that this is, you know, this is something that we talked about having added to this report, so I think it's good to bring visibility to it. And, you know, I think a couple of pieces of information to help see the longer-term rates of return, you know, understand that historically will help in that discussion.
Great, thank you.
I don't understand 16 at all. Unless I'm not reading it right, but nowhere during the year we were at 6.23, so how do we end up at 6.23 up?
Well, it would be adding. So basically, the 6.23 takes where we ended in December and compares it to where we started in January. So it takes the pluses and minuses in each of those months, and that's the year end. Yeah, yeah. So it's not, each of those months is independent of all the other activity.
Q3 in the markets essentially accounted for half of that gain. So the third quarter, you know, the gains were over 3% alone on a balanced portfolio, 60-40.
So if I could just circle back around on Mary's observation of the plan manager, and we get, on a quarterly basis, I know that's going to be too small to see, but we get from the plan managers a detailed breakdown of each of the investment by their, you know, within each of the different funds broken down by their investment types. So we have the equities and we have the fixed income. And so we could see how each of those are performing against their benchmarks for, you know, on an ongoing basis. So like I said, we get this quarterly. We can make sure as part of the work that is done on the long-term liability end, PFM is going to be involved anyway because they're helping out. They obviously have the performance data, the historical performance data. So CARFAC can be sure to ask them as many questions as you feel comfortable or you would like to make sure that you feel comfortable with how they're performing. But when you take a look at the Q4 of 15 performance, both in terms of the fixed income and the equities, they did miss the benchmark by a little bit more than 0.5%, but even the fixed income was basically flat or just slightly above zero, as Leo had pointed out. But bringing this up was to make sure that CARFAC understood that we have the information that we can present or provide you, so that when PFM's in the room helping us out with the long-term liability project, we can be sure to ask those questions. And actually, with it, that concludes the fourth quarter summary report. And we'll do this again next month with the first quarter of 2017.
Very good. Thank you so much. And thank you all for your questions and comments. That brings us to new business. Bill, I'm not aware of anything in that category.
Nor am I.
So on to old business, and this being kind of the beginning of the year, I'm not aware of any of that either. So we have two members of the public. Any comments, Phil or John? Okay. That being the case, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. So be it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.